Well, good morning, everybody. My connection to architecture and design has mostly been in my working career as a journalist. I've edited various architecture magazines, and my connection with St Bride's Fleet Street is that I chaired the fundraising appeal, which the first phase of which resulted under John Smith's able guidance in the restoration of the spire, which you've seen. So that rather gleaming, almost new wedding cake spire outside was the result of raising the best part of £1 million. And we've got a second phase of our appeal, which is to create something that's going to be called the Wren Centre, and that's going to be in the crypt underneath the church. And we're going to put in a new entrance from the street at the east end of this site, because as you probably saw, the church actually stands on a sort of plinth and the ground drops away towards the east end. So actually we'll be able to make a new access into that space from the street without having to come into the church necessarily. And what we're going to do there is to show all the work that Christopher Wren did in the City of London. Very, very substantial. Obviously St Paul's Cathedral being the biggest monument he ever made. But he did dozens of smaller city churches, including this one. And the intention is it'll be a sort of one-stop shop for people who are interested in Wren and everything he did in the city, not just St Bride's, but all his work. And we're hoping to complete that work in the next 2 or 3 years. It will be dependent partly on getting some lottery funding. We see that as a kind of educational centre, as well as somewhere which would be a natural place to go if you want to study the history of St Bride's, or indeed any of other Wren's buildings, which is what we're going to hear about in a moment. What I'd say is that probably if you're thinking about the whole world of design and architecture and construction as a possible career choice in the future, I think what you'll have already understood, I'm sure, is just how many different people and activities and skills are involved in the making of any building, starting with the client, which in the case of this church was a group of parishioners who got together to raise the money after the Great Fire of London to rebuild what we now see here. Of course, a large chunk of the church was destroyed in the Blitz in 1940, though the spire remains. So you have to start off with the client, but then of course there are whole other groups of professionals, many of whom are really intimately involved with design. You've got your architects, you've got your structural engineers. These days you have your quantity surveyors who have to look after cost. You have your civil engineers who may be responsible for actually making the building. And then you have a whole load of other people, the joiners who do all the timber, the stonemasons who do their work, right through to interior designers, decorators, sometimes artists of the sort that have done that rather amazing image at the top there, stained glass artists, and so on and so forth. So the life of buildings, the life of construction, and the life of design in broadly what we call the built environment is a very varied one. There are lots of different avenues that you can take if you're interested in it to come to some sort of idea about, well, what would suit me? What is it that I might like about this whole business of building, designing, maintaining, repairing buildings, and even the things that are associated with that, like planning, construction itself. It's a big wide world. And just to put it in some sort of numbers context, the British construction industry, very roughly speaking, if you include all the repair and maintenance work that goes on, it has a turnover of about £100 billion a year, and it's responsible for about 10% of the nation's economy. So it's not just about building the odd house here or there or the occasional office block. It's actually a huge part of the national economy, which is why there are hundreds of thousands of people involved in it in many ways, shapes or forms. And if you include all the people who are involved with making all the building materials, etc., etc., there could easily be 1 million or more people involved in this industry. And the proportion of architects is quite small, really. It's probably about 20,000 architects in the UK. Well, Wren, of course, was probably the greatest, or I say the greatest architect that this country has ever produced. But he was much more than an architect, as you're about to hear. I'm going to hand over to Adrian Tinniswood, who's a historian, and I can recommend to you his biography of Christopher Wren, which is called His Invention So Fertile. Adrian, over to you.
We all know about the fire. We all know about the fire of London, but just put yourself for a minute in the situation of this Saturday. You have a good Saturday night, it's fine. You wake up on Sunday and you turn the TV on and there's a fire. There's a fire down in the east of London. There's a fire down around the Tower of London. No big deal. You know, there's fires in London all the time. But by Monday, that fire is moving across the city. It's moving into the old financial district, the City of London. It's moving westward, and there's a gale pushing it west all the time. And that fire's starting to get out of hand. There's no fire brigades. Nobody's actually trying to put the fire out even. They're all running. Most people are running to see the fire. They're standing around gawping. That's all they're doing. They're coming to look. They're not doing anything else. And as it dawns on them that this fire is moving towards where they live, they stop looking and run back to their homes and start to move their goods out. They start to evacuate their houses. But still no one tries to put the fire out. And by Tuesday, it's reached St. Paul's Cathedral. And the old medieval St. Paul's Cathedral goes up like a bomb. It explodes. There is, just outside here, down Fleet Street, there would have been the lead from the roof of St. Paul's running down Ludgate Hill to Fleet Street in a molten stream, this fiery red stream, like a volcano. The lead pouring down the street. The old cathedral has gone, and by Tuesday night, this place is probably burning as well. Everybody thinks the fire is not an accident. Everybody thinks it's a terrorist attack. Everybody does. They're wrong, but they all think that, because we're at war with Holland in 1666 when the fire happens, and England not only is at war with Holland, we've just burned down a Dutch town 2 weeks before. So everybody thinks it's the Dutch getting their own back. How else could you explain the fact that fires are breaking out all over the city? It's arsonists, it's firebombers, it's terrorists, it must be. Well, it wasn't. It was the fact that this wind that was blowing over London was actually picking up burning embers and flinging them across the city. So fires were breaking out behind you, in front of you, to the one side of you. No one knew what was going on. Everybody was petrified. When the fire finally finished in around about the Wednesday, so it'd be the 5th or the 6th of September 1666, something like 5/6 of the city, 80% of the city, was completely destroyed. If you can make out that picture, and it's hard to see it from where you are at the back, but if you can, there's the Tower of London down the right-hand side. There's the Thames you can see along the bottom. Where are we? We're somewhere around here, aren't we? My geography's lousy. Is that right? We're round about here. St. Paul's Cathedral is over here. All that white patch you can see, all that white D shape, that's fire damage. That's the City of London gone completely. If you compare that with the bomb damage that Paul was just mentioning, the bomb damage that was done in the Second War, German bombs falling on the city in 1940, the bomb damage to the City of London, that same area, and there's the Tower of London down the bottom right again, there's the Thames running along the bottom of the picture. The fire damage is shown on this map by black spots. So all those German bombs did nothing like as much damage as the fire of London did to the city. And then when it's over, people say, well, what are you going to do? What's going to happen? How are we going to get London back together? One of the things that everybody started thinking about doing was rebuilding it completely. So within a week or so, lots of people came in with new plans. John Evelyn, the diarist, came in with a new plan to redesign London. Robert Hooke, chemist, came in with a new plan to design. You've got to say, I mean, these aren't imaginative, are they? Say a new plan to design the City of London. Basically, you get a bit of graph paper and draw lines on it. You know, and some of them are even worse than that. This looks like a sort of like a drafts board. This again, it's a design for the entire City of London. Come on, you can do better than that. We could all do better than that. One of the plans that was brought in, though, just in the week after the fire, was by a young astronomy professor from Oxford. He was in his 30s, he was 33, and his name was Christopher Wren. And he wasn't an architect. He'd trained at Oxford as an anatomist, as a physician. He then got interested in maths. He then moved into astronomy. And in 1657, he became a professor. He's only 25. He became a professor of astronomy here in London, and then a few years later, a professor of astronomy in Oxford. That's what his day job was. That's what he did for a living. But like a lot of gentlemen in the 1660s, a lot of gentry types, he dabbled. He'd had a go at building, at sort of designing a few small buildings. He had planned others. And on the strength of his contacts, not his talent, on the strength of his contacts, his uncle had been a bishop in the Church of England. He knew the Archbishop of Canterbury. He knew the right people. He knew the King. He knew Charles II. On the strength of his contacts, he started to came to advise on what to do with rebuilding the city, and indeed with rebuilding some of its main landmarks. And of course, the big landmark was St Paul's Cathedral. This is what St Paul's Cathedral looked like after the fire. Hardly any of it. And Wren was told he couldn't rebuild the City of London. It was just going to be too complicated. Apart from anything else, no one knew who owned what. No one knew who rented what. The idea of just sweeping it all away was impossible. It would run roughshod over too many people's property rights. They couldn't do it. It's a shame. If you want to see what Christopher Wren's London looks like, go to Washington, D.C., because 100 years later, Thomas Jefferson whipped Wren's plan for London and turned it into Washington. You can see Wren's London in Washington today. He was given the job, this astronomy professor, he was given the job of patching up St Paul's Cathedral. Took quite a bit of patching up when it looked like that. His first idea, this is called the first model because it was Wren's idea, was for saving the east end of the cathedral. It wasn't going to work. They thought they could sort of patch up bits of the cathedral, but then there were falls of masonry, workmen were killed, and they thought we're going to have to take the whole thing down. It's just not going to work as it is. And so Wren was asked to come up with a design, a completely new design for a cathedral. This is what he came up with. Now, you just think about this for a moment. And Paul's been talking about the construction industry today and how complex it is and how many different specialists are involved in the construction industry today. Here, you have an academic, an astronomy professor from Oxford who knows nothing, basically, about building. He comes along and he's given the chance to design one of the most important buildings in the country, with no experience, with no qualifications, with no knowledge of the building trade, really. And he comes along to the Church of England, to the Dean and Chapter of St Paul's and says, I can do this, let me have a go. I've just been to Paris, is what he says. I've just been to France, and I've seen domes. There are no domes in England in 1666. We haven't done domes. But he's been to France, he's seen domes, quite a difficult structure, a dome. It's hard to do. And this professor, this 30-something professor, comes along and says, let me have a go, I can do that. And the Church of England says, yeah, do it. The great thing about the time when Wren was alive is that you could do that. You could just move from one profession to another. You think about it, it's a time when you could know everything there was to be known. I mean, Wren was brilliant. He was a SWAT. He went to university when he was 16, 17. Even when he was a student, everybody called him, everybody said he was really bright. That miracle of a youth, that extraordinary genius, everybody talked about him. He was also quite short. It's funny, isn't it? Your perceptions of people in the past, well, are kind of conditioned by the way they look somehow. I was always slightly surprised, and I'm 6'4", I'm sort of 1 metre 80 odd, but Wren was about this tall. He was about this big. But that doesn't mean he wasn't really bright. He was really intelligent. And he said, let me have a go. Let me just have a go. He got people to help him. He's working on all the buildings he does in London. He's working very closely with the building trades. He's working very closely with mason contractors. So when Wren has a bright idea and draws something, you can bet your life there's going to be a professional builder, a joiner, a bricklayer, who's standing there looking over his shoulder saying, that's never going to work. That's never going to work. But it's Wren's inspiration, it's Wren's drive, Wren's vision that starts to slowly rebuild the landmarks of London between 1666 and Wren's death in 1723. It takes a long time, 60 years nearly, isn't it? 50 odd years. He comes up with this plan, which is called the Greek cross plan for the tower, for St. Paul's. It's basically a huge dome with 4 little sticky out wings, four arms to it. That develops into what's known as the Great Model. This is called the Great Model design for St. Paul's because they made a great model of it. It's that simple. And this is a great model. I don't know if anyone's seen it or if you're going to get the chance to see it. You're going to see it? Brilliant. This thing it will just blow you away. This thing is between 5 and 6 meters long. You used to be able to duck down, it's on a table. You used to be able to duck down under the table and come up inside that model. It's a fantastic thing. It took 2,230 man-hours to make. The King's Sergeant painter painted all the details on it. This was Wren's best building. It was the best thing he ever did. And when it was finished, the Dean in Chapter at St. Paul's took a look at it, at this model, and said, actually, I don't think so. We don't really like it very much. You'd think, wouldn't you, they might have thought of that earlier, before the 2,230 man-hours went into it. You'd have thought they might have given him a hint, but they said, no, this won't do. We don't want this, thank you very much. That's what it looks like inside. That's Wren, that's Christopher Wren. That's what the Great Model looks like inside. Wren was devastated when he was told he couldn't build a Great Model for St. Paul's. I mean, he's still a professor of astronomy. 3 years after the fire of London, he gets offered the job of Surveyor General of the King's Works. The Surveyor General of the King's Works is basically the King's architect. It's the best architectural position in the country. And Wren gets it, not because he's a brilliant architect, he hasn't actually built anything quite, but because of his connections with the King. The last Surveyor General of the King's Works before Wren was a man called John Denham, who was a brilliant poet who didn't build a single thing. John Denham gave up the job when he died. Shortly before he died, he went into Charles II's private bedchamber in the Palace of Whitehall. This is John Denham, and told the King that he was actually that the Holy Spirit come to judge him, and he got to sort of mend his ways. They all decided that John Denham had been working a bit too hard, and maybe they just thought he ought to sort of step back a little bit. He appointed Christopher Wren in his place. Denham died, and Christopher Wren, aged 36, 37, became the Surveyor General of the King's Works. He became the senior architect in Britain. And he hadn't actually finished a single thing. And he wasn't sure if he wanted to be the senior architect in Britain, because he didn't give up his day job as professor of astronomy in Oxford. He carried on being a professor and just used to pop back and forth between Oxford and London, because he didn't know if he wanted to be an architect or an astronomer. Tough call. However, when the great model was turned down, Wren wept. Wren was a very difficult, he was a very kind of introverted man, very reserved. He lived life in his head. He wasn't a very sociable character at all. He was brilliant, but he wasn't very social. He lives for 91 years, you know, Christopher Wren. He has a long life for that time. He's married twice, but he's actually only married for 9 years of those 91 years. His first wife dies after 6 years of marriage. His second wife dies after 3 years of marriage. So most of his time is spent on his own. His grown-up kids look after him later in his life. He lives in Scotland Yard, down by Charing Cross. He's got a house down there. And he lives most of the time in coffee houses around this part of London, drifting in and out of builders' offices, and he lives in his head. He's a very kind of cerebral, very intellectual man, and he very rarely shows emotion. And one of the very few times he does show emotion is when the great model is turned down and he weeps. He goes to Charles II on his knees and begs the king to make the Church of England change its mind. They won't. They won't. And they won't for a number of reasons. One reason is because Wren's design has got this blooming great dome over the top of it. You couldn't finish the church and have it in use for services until the whole building was completed, because you've got to roof it. And the Dean and Chapter at St Paul's thought they were going to be dead by the time this place was finished. They wanted something that was a more conventional cross shape, because with a cross-shaped cathedral, you can start at the East End and you can work backwards with the construction. By the time you've got so far down from the East End, you can start actually worshipping. You can start having prayers at the East End, and you can just board the rest of it up and carry on building backwards. So they said to Rome, no, we want something much more conventional. They're also worried that it looked a bit too Roman Catholic, that this is a time in the 1660s and 70s when Roman Catholicism is feared in England, really feared. And they Wren's design looked a bit too popish, a bit too Roman Catholic, not Anglican enough. So Wren said, okay, you want something nice and normal and ordinary, I'll give it to you. And what he gave them is that, which I don't know about, I think it's the most ridiculous looking thing I've ever seen. It's this kind of saucer dome with a drum on top of it, with a melon on top of that, with a sort of Chinese pagoda thing on top of that. It is ridiculous. And the Dean and Chapter of St Paul's took one look at that and they said, that's exactly what we want. We love it. This is just what we're after. So Wren was told, this is called the warrant design, because Charles II signed a royal warrant saying this was going to be St Paul's Cathedral. This is what Wren was designed, this is what he was going to build. The fact was that when the king told Wren that's what he was going to build, he told him privately that if he wanted to tweak that design a little bit, that would be all right. So he did. Just a little bit, just a tiny little sort of tweak to that ridiculous melon dome and pagoda ensemble. I mean, people used to say, you know, that nobody noticed, that when they took the scaffolding down from St Paul's, everybody must have been hugely surprised because they were expecting that, and they got that. I mean, that's crazy, but of course people noticed. They must have realised. But it took a long time. It took 35 years to build this. And that was probably the quickest building of a cathedral in the history of England up to this point. Nobody had built a cathedral from start to finish before. It had always taken too long. It had taken many lifetimes. Wren's cathedral was built. He's the first person, probably anyway, the first person in British history to build a cathedral from start to finish. His big problem when he started wasn't just the design, it wasn't just building the thing, it was actually knocking the old one down. Because although the old one was in ruins, they couldn't get the ruined walls down, it was too strong. This medieval cathedral, these bits, these fragments were too powerful. What he did in the end, he went to the Tower of London, where there were military engineers and gunners, and he got them to come along to the old St Paul's Cathedral. And one of the big problems was the tower at St Paul's. The four corners of this huge central tower were still standing. So he got them to put a charge of explosives, to put some gunpowder under one corner of this tower, and to light a very long fuse, to light a long fuse. And they blew up one corner of the old Tower of St. Paul. It was fantastic. People didn't tend to use gunpowder in the construction industry until this point. I mean, it had been used, but not quite in that way. It was so successful that when Wren was out of town giving a lecture in Oxford, his assistant, his clerk of works, he thought, I don't need to go, there's still a bit of the wall standing. He thought, I don't need to go to the Tower of London. I'm just going to get a hold of some gunpowder and I'm going to blow the rest of it up myself. So he made a hole in the wall in the corner of this tower again. He put in this charge of gunpowder, he lit this fuse. He put in too much gunpowder, quite a lot too much gunpowder. And London knew it when, for example, when two seamstresses, two women who were doing needlework a mile away in their upstairs room found a chunk of St. Paul's Cathedral come through their window and out the back wall. It just blew up and just scattered right across the city. And the dean and chapter said to Wren, you're not going to do that again, are you? You're not going to do that again. So Wren was still struggling with ways to knock down the old stuff. He came up with a classical Roman idea of a battering ram on huge A-frames. So these massive timber A-frames, and slung from the A-frames, there's a big pole, like a telegraph pole, with an iron claw on the end of it. And the idea was that 20 or 30 men would swing this battering ram against the walls to get them down. The first day they used it, they swung the battering ram, but one of the labourers got in the way. Very messy, very nasty. And in fact, the unsung heroes of the rebuilding of London, Wren gets all the credit, and Wren was a genius. I mean, Wren's my hero. He's the most fantastic guy. But we often forget that the real builders of London after the fire, were just ordinary people. They were labourers. There were men and women carting away rubble, knocking down buildings. There were bricklayers and joiners. We don't know their names, half of them, but they're the real heroes in rebuilding London. And there were casualties all the way through the building programme of the city. You can see in building accounts there are payments to widows, there are payments to mothers whose sons didn't come home that day. There are payments to people, you break a leg, you fall, you break a leg. That can be fatal in 17th century England. No antibiotics there. The slightest injury can be dangerous. And the construction industry is not the safest of industries today even. In the 17th century, it was a dangerous way to earn a living. You imagine being up at the top of St. Paul's Cathedral on planks, scaffolding, fairly rickety ladders, no harnesses, no safety at work policy at all. You're just sort of bouncing around up there, and people fell. People fell regularly. There are dozens and dozens of people who died in the building of St. Paul's Cathedral alone. Anyway, so while Wren is rebuilding St. Paul's Cathedral, he's also getting used to this architecture thing. He quite likes it. He becomes Surveyor General of the King's Works, and he does some more rebuilding in London. So, for example, the Customs House down by the Thames, down by London Bridge and the Tower of London are burned down. Really important to have a customs house because all the shipping comes into London, duties and taxes have to be paid before the ships can be unloaded. Wren builds a new customs house in 1669. He designs one. He and Robert Hooke designed the monument, which if you've been down to London Bridge and St Magnus Mott, you've seen. Yeah, has anyone been up this? Has anyone ever been to the top of the monument? It's amazing. Yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, when you get to my age, it kind of taxes your legs a bit, but you get the most fantastic views over the city. Wren designed this. He designed this primarily as a monument to the fire, but also as a giant fixed telescope. He's an astronomer, remember? And somebody had given him these huge lenses, and he thought, what can we do with these lenses? I know what we'll do. We'll stick them into this pillar. Now, clearly, your view's a bit restricted because you can't move it at all, so all you're seeing is what goes overhead. But he intended it as a telescope, a fixed axis telescope. It wouldn't work because even in 1670 odd, when this was built, the traffic was so bad in London that the vibration meant you couldn't take proper observations through the telescope, so they abandoned it. And just his original idea for the top of the monument was for a phoenix. You know, the idea of the phoenix rising from the ashes, and you'll see that at St Paul's if you've not seen it before. That it's a potent symbol of the rebirth of the city. And he wanted a phoenix, or rather the city authorities, I should say, wanted a phoenix right at the top of the monument, wings outstretched. This is my phoenix impression. It's not great, I know, but it's the best I've got. This phoenix on top of this thing. Wren said, great, first gust of wind you get, that phoenix is going to be halfway across the Thames. It's going to blow off. So let's do something a little bit more simple. Let's do something a bit more straightforward. We will have a flaming urn, a gilded flaming urn, and that's what you've got. We then have Wren working, as you've heard a little bit today. Before that even, he designs, follows through his astronomy, his interest in astronomy. He designs the Royal Observatory out at Greenwich. This is a building by Wren. They were going to put it in Hyde Park, in which case we would all be talking today about Hyde Park mean time. They decided it was too smoggy, so they moved it out to Greenwich, and that's why you get Greenwich Mean Time today. And of course, Wren designed the city churches, like this one. 56 city churches were designed by Wren and his team. He didn't design them all personally, but his vision, his guiding hand, you can see in all of them. Some of them are really weird. I mean, they've got the most ridiculous names. St Antolin here, St Bennet Fink, St Vedaste Alias Foster, St Mildred Poultry, St Dionys Backchurch. They're very strange names. A lot of them have gone. There are 23 of Wren's churches left in the city, and if you walk through the City of London today, it seems like there's a Wren church in every street corner. Imagine twice as many as those, twice as many. There were 89 churches destroyed in the fire, and originally they were only going to rebuild 30 of them. And then somebody said, well, quite a lot of people said, hold on, God has just punished us for our wicked ways by burning down the city, and we respond by building fewer churches. Stupid move. So they upped the number of churches they were going to build, and they decided to build 56, including a couple outside the city. St James's Piccadilly is one. And Wren's team is responsible for one of the biggest rebuilding schemes, church rebuilding schemes in history, in fact. St Mary Le Bow, High State. This is St Mary Le Bow in Victorian times with some rather ordinary stained glass in it. We've got on the right, there's St James Garlic Hive, which was nearly destroyed during the Second War when a bomb fell through the roof, rolled down the aisle, and didn't go off. 50 years later, a crane was passing St James Garlic Hive. It took the corner a little bit too tightly, and it fell on the church and demolished it just about. They had to rebuild half of St James Garlic Hive. You've got churches like St Mary Aldermary. Wren's style of building, that cool, clean look that you've got here, that you've got at St James Garlic Hive, that wasn't to the taste of all the parishioners. They didn't, all the parishioners, or the vestries of the London churches didn't all like modern architecture. You always get a few, don't you? They didn't like modern architecture. They wanted old stuff. They wanted their churches to look like they'd looked before the fire. And at St Mary Aldermary here, they insisted. Wren said, I want to build you something modern. And the parish said, no, we want old stuff. So he built them this, basically a Gothic revival church that you can see on the left, complete with a fantastic fan vaulting. The only church, I've got to show you this because I've got to share this with you. Do you know the only Wren building that I have not seen in the world? Because you can probably tell that I'm quite upset. I'm a Wren obsessive, I'll tell you, I am. The only one I've not seen yet is this one. And this is a Wren church in Missouri, in America. It's called St Mary Aldermanbury. And it's here because after the war, the Prime Minister, the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, gave a speech here at a college in which he talked about an iron curtain has descended over Europe. That phrase, the Iron Curtain, comes from Churchill's speech. And to commemorate Churchill's speech in Fulton, Missouri, some American academics came over here, picked up the ruins, the bombed out ruins of St. Mary Aldermanbury, took them back to Missouri and rebuilt them. So this is a real Wren church, rebuilt and restored in Missouri. One of these days I'm going to see it. One of these days I'm going to see it. It's a beautiful looking place. He didn't do them all. I mean, he didn't design them all personally. We know he didn't. This is St. Edmund the Martyr. And this was designed by Wren's assistant, a bloke called Robert Hooke, who was a friend of Wren's. And I know this is by Hooke because I recognise the draftsmanship. We know that Hooke drew this. But Wren was responsible in other ways. Wren supervised the whole programme. Wren said what would work and what wouldn't work. And we know that in this case, because St. Edmund the Martyr, you can probably just see, if you squint up your eyes, there's a squiggle in the pediment over the entrance. If I blow that up, the squiggle is actually a CW for Christopher Wren. It's Wren signing off Hooke's drawing, saying, yes, this one will do. We'll go with this one. The churches that we know Wren did design are frankly the best. You're sitting in one now. It doesn't get much better. I mean, St. Bride's has been knocked around, it's been bombed, it was Victorianised before it was bombed. It's gone through some stuff, but it doesn't get any better than this. I mean, just look, it doesn't. The good ones are ones that Wren personally designed, like this one, like St. James Piccadilly. One of my favourites, apart from St. Bride's, is St. Stephen Walbrook, which you can see here, and which again is a stunner of a church. That's been knocked around a bit as well. They took the altar out in the 1970s. They put in a big chunk of marble in the centre of the church, and all the pews actually go round it. So this is the altar that you can see on the right hand side there. This is the altar with all the pews around it. It feels a bit like a sort of group therapy session. You're all sort of sitting around in a circle and holding hands, I'm sure. It's not the church as Wren designed it, but again, if you get the chance, if you're in the city of London and you get the chance to go to Stephen Walbrook, you'll see Wren at his best. It's a brilliant piece of work. He didn't. I've got to say before I move on that Wren, even though my hero, no doubt about it, he was on the take. He used to take backhanders for doing work here and there. Very difficult for me to admit this, but it's true. We normally with bribery, you don't hear about it by its nature. It's kept secret. But with all the parishes, the vestry committees that run the churches in the City of London, they all kept accounts. They all had to account for every penny. And that meant they accounted for the presents which they used to give to Christopher Wren and his workmen. And they're not called bribes, they're called gifts to encourage Sir Christopher to move on with the work. And somehow, churches where the work was going very slowly, if they gave a present to Sir Christopher to encourage him to carry on with the work, their church got moved up the list. Because you think, I mean, there's a huge problem with trying to build 56 churches at one time. It took about 50 years to build them all. And some churches are pushing, they want their church built first. Others, frankly, couldn't care less whether their church is built at all. So there's all kinds of internal politics. And money was part of that political game. Over and over again, you'll see Wren being given a present, 10 guineas, 20. At one point, he gets 3 different churches give him a hogshead of wine each. Now, a hogshead of wine was 50 gallons, so what's that? Sort of, I can't work out what it is. I mean, it's something like 300 or 400 litres, I suppose, isn't it? 3 churches, each giving him a hogshead of wine. It's a wonder he managed to design anything. He must have been flat out for half his career. Apart from the churches, apart from St. Paul's, apart from the monument, apart from the customs house, you see Wren defining London in other ways. So, for example, over at Chelsea, Wren designs the Royal Hospital at Chelsea, which is a hospital for veteran soldiers. The idea was, in fact, Louis XIV in France. Louis XIV built a huge Veterans Hospital in Paris. And because the French had done it, we thought we ought to do it too. So first Charles II and then his brother James II, who came to the throne in 1685, they decided to build this great sort of, I say a hospital, it's really a veterans' home. It's not for sick soldiers, it's for soldiers who are worn out in the service of their country. So they decide to build a huge new hospital at Chelsea. Wren is given the design of it. A little bit later in the 1690s, they decide to do the same thing for sailors. We've got a much bigger navy than army in the 17th century, and we've got lots and lots of crippled and maimed and poor sailors. So William and Mary get Wren to convert an old royal palace at Greenwich and to build a huge hospital for sailors at Greenwich. And again, you can see that to this day. Outside London, Wren built a number of palaces. He wanted to rebuild Hampton Court Palace on the left here. He wanted to knock the whole thing down, get rid of all that boring Henry VIII Tudor stuff, and build a nice, bright, modern palace. William and Mary decided they hadn't got the money for that, but they let him rebuild the state apartments there. In Cambridge, he built the beautiful Trinity Library, Cambridge, which is one of the most glorious buildings in the world, and he built a number of buildings in Oxford and in Cambridge. He tried to build a vast royal palace at Winchester, down in Hampshire. This was going to be a palace to rival Versailles. It was enormous, with about sort of 7 or 8 courtyards, hundreds of bedrooms, offices, staterooms. But when it was just about finished, he was building it for Charles II, and they were just putting the roof on it, and Charles II died. His brother James II comes to the throne of England. James II takes one look at this vast palace at Winchester and says, I don't like it, I'm not staying there. And it's never completed, it's never finished. Wren also, all this time, was working, as you'll see later today, was working on St. Paul's Cathedral. St. Paul's took a lifetime to build. The foundation stone was laid in 1675, so it was 9 years of trying to knock the wretched thing down. But 9 years before they could start the building work after the fire. 1666 it burns down, 1675 it's built, it's begun. The official finishing date for St. Paul's Cathedral is 1710, but it wasn't anything like finished by then. The East End was completed. This is a picture of the first service that was held there in, I can't remember when it was now, something like 1690 or 1701. So they were using the cathedral, but they were still building it. And Wren was still experimenting all the way through. He had designs for St. Paul's, but as you saw earlier, as he goes on, he keeps tweaking those designs. He keeps changing them, trying to improve them. He's working with 11 different firms of builders. So there's not just one contractor on the site here. There are 11 building firms. And actually coordinating the work of 11. Do you know, the dome, there were 4 building firms, each building a quarter of the dome of St. Paul's. And it's a miracle it joins up at the top. It's an incredible piece of work. And one of the things that we often forget about Christopher Wren, he's a brilliant designer, he's a brilliant architect. He was also a brilliant manager. That's what he spent most of his time doing, was managing building works. He didn't spend most of his time designing. He spent his time working out where the drains went and whether a builder was trying to cheat him or not. Most of his days were spent at St. Paul's or at coffee houses just up Fleet Street that he was regular visitor at. And he used to see workmen and he used to measure their work. They'd come in and say, well, you know, we agreed £1 for 100 feet of walling. And Wren would go along personally and sort of measure it and say, well, that's short. I'm not paying you yet. I'm not paying it. I'm what was called baiting their bills. That was actually reducing their bills. They would come in with it's part of the game. They came in with inflated bills. He turned around and said, that's nonsense. I'm not paying you that. Go away and think again. That's what Wren's working day was. It wasn't designing a cathedral or a church or a monument or a hospital for veterans. His working day was working with people, trying to get the job done. That's what he did most of the time. St. Paul's had enormous problems. again, as you'll see later, I think, the biggest problem, and one I would love to have seen when Wren found out, the dome of St Paul's, which weighs as much as, the dome weighs as much as the Titanic. And it's all pressing down on, it's pressing down, this is the center of the dome, you'll see this today. And it's supported on 8 huge pillars. So that you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, trust me, there are 8 of them. The whole thing is supported on 8 pillars. Those pillars are in turn supported in the crypt of St Paul's on 8 more pillars. And one day, Christopher Wren, one of the masons, takes Christopher Wren down into the crypt when St Paul's is almost finished and says, look at this. And what Wren sees is that those 8 pillars in the crypt are bursting. They can't take the weight of that fully laden Titanic. And I often wonder what the expression on Wren's face was, you know, because he couldn't start again. He can't rebuild it. It's too late. The thing is just about finished. What he did do is he ordered ironsmiths and anchorsmiths to forge massive iron bands to wrap around those pillars to try and hold them in place. He put huge iron bolts through them. We like our heroes to be perfect, you know. We don't like the notion that Wren botched things up. He did because he's experimenting all the time. There's one of the other things he did was to have a huge iron chain, a massive chain, which wraps around the drum of the dome, because he and some of the others were anxious that the weight of the dome would burst this drum. So you've got this huge chain, it's an anchor chain from a ship going round there. And the story in the 19th century, 200 years later, the story was that Wren knew his design would never burst this drum. And that one night before this iron chain was sheathed in lead to stop it from rusting, one night Wren crept up there and sawed through one of the links in the chain so that nobody else would know, but he would know that chain wasn't needed. He would know that his design was perfect. That's nonsense, absolute nonsense. Wren was in a panic for most of his career about St Paul's, and he's adding chains to the place, he's putting bolts, he's put iron bands around it, everything to hold it in place. His finishing off of the dome is quite a feat of ingenuity, I think. He realised quite early on that a low dome was needed for the inside of St Paul's. You look up, but a high dome was needed for the outside because it's a monument, it's got a spire. So he hit on this notion, it's kind of hard to see here, but he hit on this notion of having 2 domes, a shallow internal dome, a tall external dome. And then in order for this cupola on top weighs something like 370 tons or something, it wouldn't, the outer lead dome couldn't support it. So what Wren did, you've got an inner dome, you've got an outer dome, and he put a brick cone between the two. So going up through the dome of St Paul's, there's this huge brick, you can see the red bit on the picture, a brick cone which is just there to support the cupola. He's the most amazing bloke. This is St Paul's finished, but you'll see that no picture does St Paul's justice. I've been there 100 times, and every single time I walk in the door of St Paul's, my heart leaps. There's just no building like it. He died in 1723, and he died a very grumpy old man. He said he wished he'd not been an architect at all. He wished he'd been a doctor, a physician, because then he would have made some real money. That's what he used to say. He felt a failure. The great model design for St Paul's hadn't been built. Winchester Palace hadn't been built. The new palace at Hampton Court hadn't been built. He felt he'd failed. But I think that he's become part of British culture in a way that very few other architects have. You know, there aren't many. This was an advert from the 1920s, a carpet advert with St Paul's in the background. St Paul's becomes a sort of symbol, you know. In the Blitz, St Paul's became a symbol of the notion that God was on our side, that we were fighting for the right. St Paul's, surrounded by bomb damage, it stays unscathed. It wasn't unscathed, in fact. And of course, in 1981, it's where the fairy tale played itself out, you know, where Princess Diana married Prince Charles. It's at St Paul's Cathedral. St Paul's is an extraordinary and special place. And even now, we go to great lengths to maintain St Paul's and that view of St Paul's. It still helps to define the cityscape in so many ways. To say that Wren was a failure is, well, I just don't know. I mean, if failure means this building, you know, if failure means St Paul's Cathedral and the Chelsea Hospital and Stephen Walbrook, if that's failure, then all I can say is I'd like some too. So all I'll say for Wren is what his son said for him, that if you seek his monuments, look around you. And that's it from me. Thank you. Thank you.